Have you ever wondered what you would do if everything you loved was destroyed before your eyes? The hidden pages of history keep secrets so deep that many prefer not to look. This is one of these stories. In Montgomery, Alabama, in the shadows of the American Civil War, Maria had a plan that would forever change the fate of one of the most powerful families in the Southern. What you are about to know has never been told in schoolbooks, as it reveals a face of the resistance that many have tried to erase. Maria's story is not just about revenge, but about the fine line between justice and despair, about the price of freedom when all doors are closed. If you believe you deserve to know the hidden side of American history, this is the time to press the inscription button. What Maria put on this Sunday banquet was not just food, and the consequences of that day still echo in the Montgomery lands. Get ready for a revelation that will change your perspective on slave resistance forever. The wind whispered between the ruins of the old Whitehall mansion, now taken by low vegetation and memories erased by time. The peeled walls still kept the echoes of silenced screams and the ghostly aroma of a fatal feast served over 160 years ago. No Montgomery tour guide mentions this place. The roots of the trees that grow between the rotten floor look like accusing fingers emerging from the earth, pointing to the sky in search of justice that official history tried to cover up. The muffled warmth of Alabama seems more intense here, as if the air itself reminds the fire of the kitchens where Maria de Montgomery, a 32-year-old slaved woman, prepared her last Whitehall family dinner in 1858. The silver spoons found on the excavation still carry the invisible waste from that meal, where death was served as a main course. The lesson that this spotted land teaches us is clear. When all the doors of justice close, revenge can become the only language understood by those who consider themselves untouchable. In the ruins of this house, the wind seems to murmur a warning. Power is never absolute, and the oppressed always find their way to freedom, even if this path is traced with blood. The dark clouds approach what is left of property, while a crow is left in what is left of the old chimney, observing as if they kept old secrets that have not yet been fully revealed. If you want to follow more cases like this, which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. Whitehall Plantation was not just a cotton cultivation place. It was a small empire that stretched over 2,000 acres of fertile land on the banks of the Alabama River. The main complex included the Big House, an imposing two-story structure with white columns and large balconies, surrounded by 12 slave cabins, arranged in a semicircle at 300 yards, close enough for constant control, distant enough to isolate the screams. The hierarchy was maintained with military accuracy. Mr. Edward Whitehall at the top, followed by his wife Eleanor, his 3 children, the foreman Silas McCormick, the armed overseers, and finally the 78 slaves, categorized by function and value. The day always started at 4:30 a.m., with the bronze bell that echoed by the property, calling for a journey that would extend to the sunset. In the countryside, the slaves bowed under the relentless sun, while the 9-pointed whip nicknamed Persuader by McCormick crackled at the slightest sign of slowness. In the Big House, the work was equally exhaustive, though confined to the suffocating walls where Mrs. Whitehall's gaze followed each movement. The currents have been replaced by something more effective: psychological terror, cultivated through public examples of punishment. The trunk remained at the center of the yard, always visible, rarely empty. The nights brought only a brief relief, interrupted by the footsteps of the female, circulating fans, choosing doors to open without warning. The air smelled of raw cotton, sweat and fear, an aroma that pervaded clothes and skin, impossible to wash. On Sunday nights, when the Whitehall family gathered for their weekly banquet, the aroma of food prepared with care to escape the windows of the Big House, mixing with the sound of silver cutlery against the thin porcelain. It was during one of these dinners that Maria observed for the first time how the whole gathered family seemed vulnerable around the same table, all serving the same platters, all drinking from the same wine. Maria was not a common slave in the Whitehall plantation. Born on the property, daughter of a domestic slave, and a slave whose knowledge of herbs was brought from Africa the Western, she inherited a double legacy: the exceptional skill in the kitchen and a deep knowledge about plants that grew in marshy lands beyond the plantation. At 32, Maria had become the main cook of the big house, a position that gave her unrestricted access to the pantry, cellar, and herbs grown in the back. Her food was so appreciated that Edward Whitehall often displayed her in front of important visitors as a valuable object of her collection. "My Mary has blessed hands," boasting, as she remained with her eyes low, her face a mask of submission that hid indashable thoughts. This position allowed Mary to pass between two worlds. During the day, she moved through the halls of the big house, absorbing conversations about family businesses, politics, and family secrets. At night, he returned to the huts where his knowledge of healing herbs made it respected among other slaves. They came secret, bringing children with fever, infected whip wounds, pains that could not show the overseers. Maria knew the power of each sheet, each root, each seed. He knew which he healed, and which they could kill. This duality created in it a living paradox. In the hands that prepared delicate dishes for the Whitehall also resided the power to heal or destroy. "It's funny how they trust me so much," he once confided to his cousin Sarah while preparing a poultice for a feverish child. "They put their lives in my hands 3 times a day without thinking twice." Irony was not lost to those who truly knew her. In secret, Maria had become guardian of stories, carrying in her memory reports of atrocities witnessed over the years, preserving them as ingredients of a bitter recipe that would one day be served. While the Whitehall enjoyed their dishes, they did not realize that each meal was an essay for something bigger. Leave in the comments, never give up the truth, if you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. The cruelty in the Whitehall plantation was not an isolated incident, but a meticulously cultivated system. In the summer of 1855, when young slave Benjamin tried to escape, he was captured only 5 miles of the property. The next day, they were all forced to witness as McCormick ripped their nails off their feet before marking it with red-hot iron. "To remind you all that feet that run away pay the price," announced Edward Whitehall, drinking lemonade in the shadow of the porch. Maria watched the face of Benjamin contouring in silent agony, her eyes finding hers for a brief moment before passing out. 3 months later, Sarah, Mary's cousin, refused to satisfy the desires of the eldest son of the Whitehall. The next morning, he was found hanging from a tree with a note attached to his dress. "Suicide by melancholy." No one questioned, although everyone knew that Sarah would never take her life. Maria prepared breakfast that morning like any other, serving perfectly cooked eggs for the young Whitehall who didn't even avoid her gaze. In the winter of 1856, 5 pregnant slaves lost their babies after being forced to work in the icy waters of the stream that cut the property. When the family doctor suggested that they should be spared such work, Mrs. Whitehall replied with disdain, "If my hunting dogs can swim in this water, why not they?" Maria served the tea as the conversation happened, her face impassive as something broke irreparably inside her. The spring of 1857 brought a new atrocity when the local reverend presented Whitehall with a leather Bible. To celebrate, Edward ordered old Isaiah, who had secretly learned to read, recites passages to other slaves. When he found out that Isaiah really understood the words, he ordered his eyes to be burned with hot iron. "Now he can memorize God's word as it should be," he commented during dinner, while Maria served the mint sauce that accompanied the lamb. Each incident was absorbed by Mary. Every horror added to the invisible recipe she prepared in her mind. His body remained in the kitchen, moving between pans and spices, but his spirit traveled to a place where justice was not just an empty word. The breaking point came on a muffled night of April 1858. Mary had given birth to a girl 3 years earlier, the result of a rare moment of joy with another slave named Joseph, who worked in the stables. Little Grace grew up protected by their discreet love, who secretly dreamed of a future where she would know more than chains. That afternoon, while Maria was preparing dinner, he heard a riot at the back of the house, ran to the window in time to see Grace playing near the kennel, where the valuable Whitehall hunting dogs were confined. One of the animals had escaped, and before someone could intervene, attacked the child. The screams attracted everyone's attention, including the Whitehall family that watched from the porch. Joseph ran from the desperate stable, and on the urge to save his daughter, deadly injured the dog with a tool. The silence that followed was more terrifying than shouting them. Edward Whitehall slowly descended the steps from the balcony. "That dog cost more than 10 like you," Joseph said calmly. The punishment was executed immediately. Joseph was tied to a pole in the center of the yard. Maria was forced to watch, holding Grace in her arms, while McCormick was methodically whipped on Joseph's back. At the 50 blows, their legs gave way. To the 70, he lost consciousness. To the 90, I couldn't breathe anymore. "Take the child to the ward," Whitehall ordered one of the overseers, pulling Grace from Maria's arms. "If it survives, it will be sold as soon as it is strong enough. I don't need descendants of violent slaves on my property." Maria did not shout it, did not beg. Something was crystallized inside her at that moment, a hard, cold core like winter ice. That night, after washing Joseph's blood from her hands, she returned to the kitchen to finish preparing the Whitehall dinner. As he cut the flesh, his tears fell silently over the board. In the cabin later, she pulled a loose floor from the floor and removed a small cloth wrapping, seeds and roots collected in the marshy regions, guarded by her father years earlier. Some to heal, some for something quite different. Next to Grace's body, which had not survived the injuries, Maria made a sealed promise with a kiss on her daughter's cold forehead. They will pay. All of them. The Whitehall were not simple farmers, but a family empire with deep roots in Alabama's power structure. Edward Whitehall, the 58-year-old patriarch, carried the pride of 3 generations of slave owners and refined cruelty over the years. Slavery is a system that requires constant maintenance, like any quality machine, he used to tell his children. His 49-year-old wife, Eleanor, hid under hand gloves that did not hesitate to apply punishment with the iron ruler to domestic slaves. "It takes constant discipline or they forget their place," he taught the daughters of other plantation families. The firstborn, Thomas Whitehall, 27, was known for his explosive temperament and testing young slaves before deciding to buy them. The twins, Richard and William, 23, competed with each other into cruelty, turning punishments into entertainment bets. Below them, a precise structure of subordinates. Silas McCormick, the main foreman, whose whip had taken more lives than the harsh winter. Dr. Fleming, a family doctor who signed death certificates with invented causes. Reverend Caldwell, who blessed the venture with selected biblical passages. It was a fortress of institutionalized wickedness, protected by money, political influence, and the silent connivance of the Southern society. The event that sealed the Whitehall fate took place in June 1858, when the state governor accepted an invitation to dinner at the plantation after the inauguration of the new railway line that would facilitate the flow of cotton. It was an extraordinary occasion that required prepared preparations. "I want everyone to see the prosperity we built here," Edward said during breakfast. "Nothing must be out of place." For Mary, who watched from the kitchen door, it was as if the universe offered a response to her unpaid prayer. A dinner where not only the Whitehall family would be gathered, but all those who supported their power. The date was set, June 16th, a Sunday. Maria watched the ad with impassive face, but her eyes recorded every detail. That night, when she returned to her cabin, she opened the hiding place under the floor. This time, besides her herbs, he removed a small leather notebook where his father had recorded ancestral knowledge in symbols that only she understood. Each page turned was one step towards a no-return plan. There was the combination he sought, the answer he needed. In closing the book, Mary was no longer just a slave. It was the execution of a sentence. The central courtyard of the Whitehall plantation became the scenario for what would be remembered by surviving slaves as the Day of Truth. A week before the big banquet, Eleanor Whitehall decided it was time for a public example to ensure exemplary behavior during the governor's visit. The chosen one was Mary. The accusation, a linen napkin found stained after washing. "Unacceptable neglect," said Eleanor before tea all the slaves gathered by force. Punishment, 20 whip applied by McCormick, followed by the humiliation of having a shaved head, a symbol of degradation especially painful for enslaved women. Maria was tied to the central pole, her dress torn on her back. The first blow fell like liquid fire, but no sound escaped from his lips. In the 10th blow, his legs trembled uncontrollably. In the 20th, blood drained even his heels. When they finally released her, Eleanor personally cut her hair with sheeping sheep, throwing the strands on the floor and forcing Mary to collect them one by one. "To remember the cost of imperfection," he said, handing him a small wooden box to keep what was left of his dignity. The crowd of slaves watched in forced silence, low eyes, rapid hearts. Edward Whitehall watched from the porch, bending bourbon as if to watch a daily show. "Now go back to the kitchen. We have menus planning," Eleanor ordered when the humiliation ended. Maria got up slowly, her back in alive flesh, the scalp burning, her face a perfect mask of submission. But something had irrevocably changed in his eyes, a calculating, cold, determined glow. Passing the slave group on the way to the kitchen, his gaze momentarily crossed with that of Abigail, the old man who knew all the stories of the plantation. The old woman nodded imperceptibly, recognizing what she saw. It was no longer pain in Mary's eyes, but fire. That night, alone in her cabin, Maria opened the box with her hair cut and, one by one, burned them in a small candle, whispering names with every strand that turned into ashes. Edward, Eleanor, Thomas, Richard, William, Silas, Fleming, Caldwell. When the last thread was consumed by fire, she blew the candle and made her final decision. The plan he had been forming in his mind for years finally crystallized in absolute certainty. Maria knew she couldn't execute her plan on her own. The night after her public humiliation, when the wounds on her back still bleeding through the makeshift dressing, she summoned a secret council. The meeting took place at the small slave cemetery, the only place rarely visited by the overseers at night. Under the starry sky of Alabama, 5 people formed a circle around the newly engaged grave of Grace, Maria, old Isaiah, blind but with infallible memory, Abigail, the elder of all the secrets of plantation, Samuel, young strong who worked in the stables, and Ruthie, a domestic slave with access to family rooms. "What I'm going to propose has no turn," Mary began, her voice a firm whisper in the darkness. "Those who prefer not to know must leave now." No one moved. One by one, Maria attributed precise functions. Samuel would be responsible for creating a distraction in the stables at the right time, ensuring that horses were not available to seek help. Isaiah, with her perfect knowledge of property even after blindness, would be the guide to the escape route through the swamps. Ruthie would collect information about the exact arrangement of the guests to the table, memorizing who would sit where. Abigail would prepare the auxiliary herbs that Maria would need, mixing them to make them unrecognizable. "And the method?" Samuel asked, hesitantly. Maria removed from inside the dress a small dark bottle, almost indistinguishable in the dimness. "My father called Sigh of Death," he explained, "extracted from plants that grow only in the deepest areas of the swamp. Undetectable in taste, it mixes perfectly with red wine. It acts slowly, first causing discomfort, then gradual paralysis, finally breathing stop. When symptoms become evident, it will be too late." A heavy silence followed the explanation. "The date?" Ruthie asked finally. "June 16th, the governor's banquet. The moment when everyone will be gathered celebrating his power over us." Maria then drew a detailed map of the property on the damp land, marking meeting points, escape routes, temporary hiding places. "After the banquet, we will have exactly 3 hours before the complete effects manifest. At that time, we need to be beyond the swamp, on the way to the north." Abigail, who had hitherto remained silent, finally said, "Day 16 is a new moon, night without light. Ancestral spirits approve their plan, Mary." When the circle broke down, each one returning silently to his cabin on different ways, the countdown had begun. 10 days to what they called the Last Supper. The eve of the banquet brought to the Whitehall plantation an atmosphere of frantic expectation. In the big house, raised silver inherited from England, they arranged the best porcelains in accurate patterns on the towel D and linen imported from France. Eleanor Whitehall personally supervised every detail, from the wildflower arrangement to the center of the table, to the exact position of the chairs. The social hierarchy should be respected, even in the arrangement of the seats. In the upper rooms, the family's clothes were prepared, shining boots, selected jewelry. Edward Whitehall, in his office, reviewed contracts and prepared gifts that would impress the governor with his view of a prosperous and expansionist South. At the same time, a second preparation was invisible in the eyes of you. In the kitchen, Maria moved with precision calculated between pans and ovens. Her face, now framed by short and irregular hair, remained impassive as she supervised the preparation of the elaborate menu. Wild asparagus soup, baked duck with orange sauce, glass pork ribs with cotton flour, corn pudding, peach pie. His hands worked automatically, trained by years of servitude, while his mind focused on another recipe. In the afternoon, when sent to the swamp to harvest fresh herbs to dinner, Maria met briefly with Abigail, who handed her a small package. "Everything prepared as he asked," the old man whispered. "Herbs to disguise the aroma are mixed in the right proportion." Maria hid the package between the leaves of mint and rosemary that she had collected legitimately. Back in the kitchen, while the afternoon was advancing, she took advantage of a moment of distraction from others to add the contents of the package to a special Bordeaux wine bottle, personally chosen by Edward Whitehall to impress the governor. The mixture dissolved perfectly in the red liquid without leaving visible features. Maria replaced the cork carefully and positioned the bottle between the others selected for the night. By falling afternoon, while the first guests began to arrive in elegant carriages, Samuel gave the combined signal, 3 knocks on the back door. It was made. The horses had been fed with a mixture that would make them unwilling later, making it impossible for any quick journey in search of medical help. Outside, the sun dived on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood red. Maria watched for a moment through the kitchen window, noting how the elongated shadows of the trees seemed dark fingers pointing toward the big house. The bell of dinner sounded, announcing the beginning of what would be remembered as the last feast of the Whitehall family. At 7 o'clock at point, the 12 guests were accommodated around the large mahogany table in the main dining room. Governor Burton occupied the right position of honor of Edward Whitehall, while Eleanor presided over the other end of the table. The 3 children Whitehall, Reverend Caldwell, Dr. Fleming, Banker Harrison and his wife, Judge Pemberton, 2 state senators and the new railroad superintendent completed the group. Crystals sparkled in the light of dozens of candles. The silver reflected the golden brightness of the candlesticks. Animated conversations about politics and business filled the environment. Maria silently entered the side door, followed by 3 domestic slaves who carried trays with the first entrance. His face remained low, submissive, while serving every plate with the precision of years of training. "Maria," called Edward Whitehall when everyone was served, "explain to the governor what she prepared for us tonight." It was a common ritual, showing off his talented slave as if it were another valuable piece of his collection. Maria advanced 2 steps and in a controlled voice described the elaborate menu. At the end, he added, "And to accompany, I selected the Bordeaux of 1847 that the Lord keeps for special occasions." A murmur of approval traveled the table. Edward smiled, pleased with the impression caused. "Excellent choice. It can serve." Maria made a discreet gesture to Ruthie, who left and returned moments later with the fateful bottle on a silver tray. With movement studied over the mental rehearsal days, Maria opened the wine and first served a small amount for Edward to prove, a tradition that he insisted on maintaining to impress guests. The patriarch turned the liquid in the glass, inhaled the aroma, tasted a sip, and nodded in approval. Mary then served each guest, starting with the governor, following the hierarchical order until the table is completed. When the last glass was filled, she retreated to the shadows near the kitchen door, watching while Edward proposed a toast to the continuous prosperity of our Southern way of life. The crystals clashed. The wine touched all lips simultaneously. Mary told mentally, 1, 2, 3. It was done. From this moment on, there was no possible return. While serving the following dishes throughout the next time, she discreetly observed the first signs. Drops of sweat on Reverend's forehead, Dr. Fleming loosening the collar, Mrs. Harrison's shaky hand as he raised his glass again. No one noticed anything abnormal, just the warmth of summer night would think. Around the dessert, Thomas Whitehall mentioned a strange feeling on his legs, soon discarded when his father suggested that it was just the effect of wine. When the coffee was served, Maria made the combined signal to Ruthie, 3 fingers disguisedly extended when collecting a tray. It was time for the second phase of the plan. While the guests enjoyed coffee in the dining room, the first serious symptoms began to speak up. Reverend Caldwell was the first to show difficulty breathing, soon followed by Dr. Fleming, who attributed the malaise to excessive heat. In the kitchen, Maria methodically organized the last phase of her plan. "Ruthie, Samuel is positioned?" he asked softly. "Yes, the horses are already unquestionable, and he deactivated the wheels of 2 carriages," replied the young woman, shaking slightly. "And Isaiah?" "Waiting at the point combined with provisions for 3 days of travel." Maria nodded, pleased. At that moment, an acute cry came from the dining room. Mrs. Harrison had passed out, falling from her chair. Chaos began to settle when Governor Burton also staggered, clinging to the table. "Something is wrong." "I can't feel my legs," Edward Whitehall murmured, his face writhing in an expression of terror by suddenly understanding what was going on. His eyes frantically sought out the living room until they found Mary to stop at the kitchen door, watching with supernatural calm. "You," he managed to articulate before his voice failed. Mary then advanced to the center of the room, her erect body, all claim of abandoned subservience. "Yes, me," he confirmed, his voice clear and firm. "This is the taste of justice, Mr. Whitehall. The same justice that you have denied Grace, Joseph, Sarah, Benjamin, Isaiah, and so many others." One by one, she looked into each person's eyes to the table, now paralyzed at different stages of agony. "You have built an empire about our broken bones and our dreams destroyed. Today, this empire falls." At that moment, Eleanor Whitehall tried to get up just to collapse again in the chair, his muscles refusing to obey. "What did you give us?" he asked in a strangled voice. "A gift from the land you stole," Maria replied, slowly walking around the table. "A combination of plants that grow in the swamps where you threw the bodies of our dead. My father called sigh of death. You will not feel pain, just the same suffering sense that Benjamin felt when he was hanged for trying to escape. The same impotence that my sisters felt when their children were torn from their arms." The 3 Whitehall sons tried to reach the weapons they kept in their pockets, their fingers now unable to grab anything. "How long?" asked Dr. Fleming, his medical training allowing him to understand the situation with terrible clarity. "Enough for each of you to reflect on your choices," Maria replied. "But not enough to find salvation." With these words, she approached Edward Whitehall, now immobile in her chair, only her eyes still able to move, overflowing with hatred and fear. Slipping, she whispered in her ear, "Grace sent memories." Then, with deliberate movements, Maria removed the master key of the pocket of the paralyzed boss and went to the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time for the frozen scene. 12 figures of power, now reduced to statues of flesh, wide eyes witnessing his own end. "The banquet is closed," he said, closing the dining room door for the last time. In the hours that followed the fatal banquet, the Whitehall plantation became the scenario of a silent revolution. Maria, with the master key in hand, quickly moved through the halls of the big house to Edward's office. There, with methodical efficiency, he opened the safe, hidden behind the portrait of the first Whitehall, and removed the documents he sought, the deeds of the ownership of the slaves. In the central courtyard, Abigail had already gathered the 78 slaves in a tense and expectant circle. "The time of liberation has come," Maria announced when she joined the group. "Whitehall and their guests can no longer hurt us." A murmur toured the crowd, a mixture of fear, disbelief, and nascent hope. Samuel advanced with a lit torch. "Everyone gets only the essentials. We have 2 hours until dawn," he instructed. Maria then executed the ritual that had meticulously planned. In the center of the yard, where so many were whipped and humiliated, She packed the ownership documents, along with McCormick's 9 tips whip, Eleanor's lace gloves, and the punishment record book. On this perverse altar of oppression, it poured the content of 3 bottles of Edward's personal stock. "With this fire, we burn the invisible currents," he proclaimed, handing the torch to Isaiah, the blind elder. "May the one to whom the vision was denied enlightening our way to freedom." Isaiah hesitated only for a moment before throwing her torch over the pile. The flames rose quickly, consuming the symbols of slavery as they illuminated the faces of the gifts with an orange glow of rebirth. Not everyone chose to leave immediately. Some, such as the very elderly or sick, decided to remain temporarily, knowing that they would have a better chance of survival in the abandoned plantation than in the difficulties of the escape. Others, moved by decades of repressed anger, wanted to witness the definitive end of the Whitehall. But most, 61 men, women, and children, formed a silent column, who followed Maria and Isaiah toward the swamps north of the property. "Don't look back," Maria instructed as they abandoned the only place many had known in their lives. "What we leave behind are just currents. What we carry on is our humanity." The procession of freeders moved as shadows between the trees, each step away from the nightmare, every breath an exercise of newly conquered freedom. When they reached the edge of the swamp, the eastern horizon began to lighten. Maria stopped for a moment, allowing one last look at the Whitehall plantation. In the distance, the first languages of fire became visible, emerging from the windows, a fire purposely started by those who had chosen to stay, a flaming funeral to a system of cruelty. "Now, our true journey begins," Maria said, turning to the group. And then, as a single entity, the liberated column disappeared into the depths of the swamp, while behind them, the Whitehall Empire was reduced to ashes under the sole sky of Alabama. The news of what happened in the Whitehall plantation spread like fire on the dry field by the South slave regions. Initially, the authorities tried to stifle the incident, fearing the power of the example. The official reports mentioned only a tragic accident involving food poisoning that killed the Whitehall family and their guests during a dinner, but the truth traveled to channels impossible to control. Whispers between slaves in neighboring plantations, code conversations in black churches, encrypted messages transmitted by street vendors. In a matter of weeks, the Montgomery method had become a ghost who haunted the dreams of slave owners in 3 states. In July 1858, an alarmed letter from Alabama Security Commissioner to the governor of South Carolina, who had survived for not attending fatal dinner, warned, "A disturbing pattern emerges in recent weeks. 3 separate incidents of poisoning in plantations, resulting in the death of 7 owners and their families. In all cases, the main cook has disappeared along with dozens of slaves. In August, the Patterson mansion in Georgia was found with the whole family killed after the Sunday dinner. At the table, the dishes still served, the bodies rigid in their chairs, and a ticket deliberately left. Served in the Montgomery style." In September, authorities in 3 states had established special patrols and implemented draconian measures: banning of slaves working on kitchens without constant supervision, mandatory food testers, severe restrictions on access to herbs and plants. At secret owners' meetings, a new term entered the vocabulary of fear: Marianism, defined as the silent and lethal resistance coming from where the least was expected. The panic among the ruling class contrasted with the silent hope that grew among the enslaved. Stories about Mary circulated in increasingly elaborate versions, that she had released hundreds, not dozens, who knew secrets of African magic that was impossible to capture because it could become a fog on swamps. For the oppressed, Mary became more than one person. It was the embodied possibility that the system was not invulnerable, that the powerful could also be defeated. In the most distant plantations, slaves began to leave small herb arrangements under their beds, not necessarily to use, but as a symbol of resistance, a silent reminder that they had choices, even in the more desperate circumstances. In October of that year, a confidential report of the state militia admitted, "The true damage caused by the Whitehall incident is not in the number of victims, but in the public demonstration vulnerability of our system. Each meal served now carries the spectrum of fear." The hunt for Maria and her Liberta group mobilized unprecedented resources in the three deep southern states. The governor of Alabama declared a state of emergency and authorized the formation of a special task force led by Captain Jeremiah Blackwood, a veteran of the Mexican War known for his brutality and efficiency. "We will not rest until each of the fugitives is captured and an example is made," he said at a conference with alarmed slave owners. Specially trained hunting dogs were brought from Virginia, indigenous scouts hired by their knowledge of the swamps, local militias mobilized with promises of generous rewards. The initial strategy focused on swamps north of the Whitehall plantation, but weeks of intensive searches only produced fake clues and ingenious traps left by Isaiah to disorient the persecutors. In mid-July, an anonymous complaint redirected the hunt to the west near the Mississippi border. A small group of fugitives was trapped in an abandoned cabin, among them Samuel, who had separated from the others to create a distraction. The following combat entered the folklore of resistance. Armed with makeshift tools, Samuel kept the militia for hours, allowing another three to escape from the back. When they finally captured him, seriously injured, Blackwood demanded information about Mary's whereabouts. Samuel's answer has entered the oral history of freed slaves. "You can kill me, but you can't kill what she has planted in us." He was hanged at the scene, his body left hanging as a warning. In August, the persecution intensified when Ruthie was captured trying to contact allies in Montgomery. Under torture, he revealed partial information that led the militia to intercept a larger group of fugitives trying to reach the Underground Railway, the clandestine network that helped slaves to escape north. In the resulting confrontation, 14 former Whitehall plantation slaves were killed or captured, but Maria and the central nucleus were still missing. The big final siege took place in September 1858, when information extracted from one of the captured led Blackwood to an isolated community in the swamp regions between Alabama and Georgia. More than 100 gunmen surrounded the settlement at dawn. What they found, however, was an organized and determined resistance. Maria had turned a group of fugitive slaves into a disciplined guerrilla force, using ground knowledge and techniques learned from natives that lived on the banks of society. The combat lasted 2 whole days, with fugitives using traps, ambushes, and evasion tactics that left 27 militiamen dead. In the dusk of the second day, with ammunition scarce and the siege closing, Maria gathered the survivors. "You are the seed of freedom," he said. "I'm just the wind that spread it." Then, in a final act of strategic sacrifice, Maria and a small group including Isaiah and Abigail created a distraction that allowed others to escape in small groups. Finally surrounded by Blackwood and her men, Mary remained upright, with no fear. His last words, later reported by a present militia, have become a reverent whisper in the senzalas for decades. "You can end my life, but my recipe will continue to be served at your tables." The stories about Maria de Montgomery's final destination have multiplied in the following decades, each version reflecting the hopes and fears of those who told them. The official version, recorded in the files of the state of Alabama, states that she was publicly hanged in Montgomery on September 29, 1858, her later burnt body to prevent her tomb from becoming a place of pilgrimage. But in former slaves' communities, alternative narratives flourished with impressive tenacity. In the black settlements of rural Georgia, it was said that Maria was never really captured. The woman executed in Montgomery was another, while the real Maria escaped north, where she continued to organize slave escapes. In the African American Mississippi churches, preachers have incorporated elements of their history into coded sermons. As the woman who served the truth in a silver tray, we must be ready to feed the hungry of justice. Objects associated with her acquired almost mystical status. A wooden spoon supposedly used in her kitchen, crossed from hand to hand as a sacred relic among freed communities. Dry herbs in small bags were kept as protective talismans. Songs emerged in the plantations, disguised as spiritual but carrying encrypted messages. To cook on Sunday, yes sir, he prepared a dinner that no one has forgotten. In the years preceding the Civil War, historians documented a significant increase in poisoning or suspected poisoning in southern plantations, many explicitly inspired by the Montgomery method. More oppressive. Post-Reconstruction academics intensely debated the historical significance of the Whitehall incident. Living myth. To the present day, in certain rural regions of Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, African American mothers whispered to their daughters, "Be strong as Mary, intelligent as Mary, just as Maria." It belongs to our hearts. Where the Whitehall plantation was, now only vegetation ruins, occasional visitors report a curious phenomenon. On the old kitchen ground, a rare type of herb is growing anywhere else in the region, a dark leafy plant with small white flowers that say local and lethal connoisseurs, and with what intention. If you watch so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Maria's story touched her heart. Share so that Mary's memory will never be forgotten.